Hi everyone, my name is Silvan. Here invited to tell you a little bit about GDPR, data protection, and how that relates to blockchain, which seems to be quite a bit of a mystery to most people. So I concentrate mostly on two things. One is decentralization, and the other thing is privacy. And those concepts by itself, they go together pretty well. But then the implementation of it, blockchain and GDPR, that's not so much of a pleasure, and that's what many people are concerned about as well. I think you're all quite aware of blockchain, one of the underlying technologies of many cryptocurrencies with some key properties. It's immutable, it's distributed, it generates time-stamped records, it's transparent, permissionless, and it's very often used for value transfer. That is true in most of the cases. However, there are also certain different blockchain types that we need to take into account, especially if we look at the specifics of how the data protection regulation, the GDPR, applies to that. So public permissionless blockchain, as we know it, is certainly not the same as a private permission blockchain where everyone has, or where basically access is tightly controlled. Then I think that everyone is a little bit aware of the underlying technologies. Hashes, basically adding certain checksums into a blockchain is a very core concept of blockchain as well. And because this is such a potential problem, let's have a look at what that does. It basically summarizes a text or an image or anything of arbitrary size. So that could be a text, could also be indeed an image, or perhaps a whole internet site into a fixed length text that can be used to then confirm that certain data was there at a certain point in time on a very high level. So all these, both like the hashes of transactions as well as the blocks linked together, make it all into the blockchain, and that is the basic concept of how that underlying technology works, the 2-minute version. So what does the GDPR require if you do certain things with personal data? So the GDPR is the General Data Protection Regulation and deals with everything around any kind of personal data. For example, it requires you to deal with data in a lawful, fair, and transparent way. It also requires you to have a purpose limitation. Only use the data that you collect of people for a certain predefined purpose that you pre-communicated, and don't go change that afterwards. If you collect something for a mailing list, you cannot be using that to sign someone up for an account later on. Data minimization, only collect the minimum amount of data for what you need. Data needs to be accurate, there needs to be a storage limitation, very interesting point on the blockchain. And there needs to be integrity and confidentiality of that data. And most importantly, there's a concept of accountability. The person or company that is collecting data is also accountable for it and needs to take all these steps to make sure that the data is secure. The other interesting point of the GDPR is that there are certain very specifically predefined roles. So there's the data subject, the person of whom you're collecting data, the data controller, the primary responsible party that is taking care of that data, and processors that are only processing data on behalf of a controller based on a written contract. The GDPR knows certain legal bases, so everyone has heard about consent, I presume. There's been many companies collecting consent for things where no consent was required, so this is very popular. But there are also other legal bases that you can use under the GDPR for collecting and storing and processing data. Performance of a contract, for example. If you have a written contract with someone, there's no need to ask for consent. If there's a legal obligation, if you need to keep data for 10 years for invoicing and financial reporting purposes, there's also no need to ask for consent for that. There are a couple that are not very relevant in most private situations, and then there's legitimate interest. And legitimate interest is if you can show, okay, I have an interest in collecting this data that outweighs the interest of a natural person to their privacy. For example, keeping server log files is something that you can easily do under legitimate interest. No need for consent there. So how about the compatibility between blockchain as a technology and GDPR as a key regulation in the EU? So there's certainly quite a bit of misalignment where the GDPR knows this storage limitation, and blockchain knows this immutability. What you write onto a blockchain cannot be changed afterwards again. Confidentiality. In public blockchains, there's not a whole lot of confidentiality. Everything is public. Everyone can download a version of the ledger and participate in the network. And accountability. Whereas on the blockchain, the big question is who's actually responsible. It's a decentralized environment, and that comes with these very specific challenges of defining who's responsible, right? And most importantly, that goes down to who is actually the controller and the processor. So if you imagine a classic situation where your bank is dealing with all your financial transactions, they're very clearly the central authority there, the central point of contact, and they are the controller for your financial transactions. And there may be others that are processors. Now, in a decentralized situation, that is certainly more difficult. You could transmit a transaction to any node in the network. Does that node, by accepting that transaction, become a controller? Good question. Who's a processor? How do these different actors, these nodes, work together? And then the big issue that everyone likes to throw at if it's about blockchain and GDPR is the right to be forgotten, or right to erasure under the GDPR. Again, like if you want to delete something, if you want to exercise your right to be forgotten, it's not great if your personal data is laying on a blockchain that is then immutable. And just to give you a bit more of an example of that, if I, okay, let's imagine I take my passport and I make one of these hashes out of it, that is always going to be the same if I use the same hashing algorithm. I take my passport, take the photo, my name, and hash it, and then this comes out, and I put that on a blockchain. That is not reversible. There's not enough information here to reverse my name and my photo and all the info on my passport. However, you can run this again. You can run the same algorithm, the same hashing algorithm, again and again and again, and you will always have the very same hash as an output. The problem with that is, if I start writing that into a blockchain or make it public in any other way, the person that has access to my passport and also knows the hashing algorithm can recreate it and identify my interaction points on the blockchain. So that is something that could indicate behavior, and under the GDPR could be understood under circumstances as personal data as well. And especially if this relates to anything sensitive. I may have purchased something, or I may have identified myself for a certain service. Some other problems of the GDPR or of blockchain, and basically the combination of, is basically the lack of experience. Both the GDPR is rather new, and blockchain is also new technology. There's also a lack of court decisions in the GDPR. There are a couple of things that have been on court right now, but it's not all that much. There's a lack of guidance. There's some guidance available, but even some key documents for what is very important. What does the GDPR actually perceive as personal data? When is something pseudonymized and when is something anonymized? There's a 38-page document guidance on that from 2014, but the problem with that is it's not officially endorsed by the EDPB, the top authority on data protection in Europe. It's an emerging technology, talking about new regulation, and also there are local implementations. So even though the GDPR is a regulation that's valid all over Europe without the need for implementation, there are local implementations. So Germany knows slightly different understanding of certain points than Estonia has, for example. And there are huge fines. The fines go up to 20 million or 4% of your total annual group revenue, and that could be quite substantial in the end. So is there anything positive there? And I think there is, actually. There's also some visionary alignment. For example, transparency. All the data is shared with all participants. This is one of the key concepts under GDPR. And this can also be perceived as a good thing, right? We're showing exactly what is being done. Data minimization. Normally, on blockchain, only confirmations or hashes or perhaps the proven facts or attestations make it onto blockchain, but not the full data set. And basically the control over one's own data with concepts such as self-sovereign identity, you have a lot of control over your own data and how you use it. right? So one of the concrete solutions is to say, okay, we store personal data off-chain. So we have in a decentralized database or a normal database, we have the certain personal data, and then in the blockchain we only write the confirmation. So later on we can check if that information hasn't changed, if that is still the same. And then about this right to be forgotten, that's normally perceived as this, right? But in my opinion, it's more like this. It's slightly inconvenient, but you can kind of like deal with it. So how so? So if these things come more together, the right to erasure, is that so absolute? And actually, if you look at the letter of the law, it is not so absolute. Only on a certain legal basis the right to be forgotten or the right to erasure exists. And also blockchain's immutability, even though everyone says like, okay, it's immutable, you can't change it. That's a matter of implementation in a way, because already in the initial white paper by Satoshi Nakamoto, there was the concept of pruning. It's probably the most forgotten concept in blockchain, but it does exist. So there is a way of getting rid of that data. It's just not very widely implemented. But if these things come together, I'm quite certain that we can find solutions, and we're working on a few solutions right now. You can think about contracted nodes, keeping all the data within Europe, for example. There's one solution called BERCHAIN that builds on IOS.io, and they basically have contracted nodes only in Europe, and they have contracts between those nodes. And through this system, you can basically make sure that you have relationships that hold up under the law as well. Using the privacy by design principle, something that already came about in the 90s from the Information Privacy Commissioner of Ontario in Canada. These foundational principles of privacy by design, if you find a way to implement that in blockchain, you can basically build privacy-friendly products from the ground up. And I think everyone in the blockchain industry is very passionate about privacy. And by using these fundamentals, you can also go a very long way to complying to the GDPR within your blockchain project. So what is next? Of course, we need to keep looking for new technical solutions. Perhaps there are smarter ways that we can do things technically. For example, zero-knowledge proof. This is something that is a fairly new technology, even in blockchain, where you basically have the way of proving to know a value without conveying any information apart from the fact that you know the value, right? And this is a very powerful concept for privacy. We also need more guidance. So the opinion that I referred to before is something that certainly needs to be updated. There's also a paper out by the CNIL, that's the French authority on data protection, and they've gone a long way into at least analyzing and giving their vision on it. I don't think that we should fare blindly with what they're saying. That's not a great idea, but there's certainly interesting thoughts, and also on the highest European level, there are things happening, thoughts emerging around how do we deal with blockchain technology. So how can the regulator help? Issue clarified guidance, update regulation, eventually, perhaps, if that happens, or find non-compliant products or services. There are quite a few products out there that say, we have a GDPR-compliant blockchain. Then if you read the white paper, or if you look at the details, yeah, not really. You solve like one little problem of the whole set of problems, but you fail to look at most of these kind of things. So if there could be some guidance in the shape of fines, making sure that the projects that shouldn't be there are not there anymore, that would be great, and that would be very helpful. And then what am I doing in the direction of put your money where your mouth is? With TECHGDPR, we are consulting blockchain projects, we're writing, we're researching, we work with exchanges, with protocols, etc., to help them comply to the GDPR. Under INATPA, International Association for Trusted Blockchain Applications, I'm co-chairing the privacy working group, and we have some discussions with the regulators there as well. And I'm also in a DIN working group, which is the German Standardization Institute around privacy by blockchain design, looking at these privacy by design principles and how this can apply to blockchain specifically. That's it. Thank you so much.